Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and this is Taking Care of Business. Joining me today is Michael Holden, who is Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist for the Business Council of Alberta. Thanks, Michael, for joining us today.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Well, let's talk about the labor force survey that was released today by Statistics Canada. We'll go by different regions and see what's happening in the labor market here. So in October for Canada, we saw an uptick of 31,000 jobs, and the unemployment rate fell by 0.2 percentage points to 6.7%. When you look at the picture overall in Canada, Michael, what do you see these days that's happening in the labor market?
Well, there really is a pretty mixed reaction across the country. And so there's a couple of things that stood out to me with this. The first one is that we saw a pretty substantial surge in employment nationwide in September, and it really trailed off in August. So that increase is, it's less than 0.2% month over month, which is not a huge increase in the number of people who are employed in Alberta or across Canada. And if you look across the country, those gains were really heavily concentrated in two areas. So Ontario saw some pretty strong gains, somewhere in the range of 37,000 jobs there. And then BC also had a good month. And so we've seen strong growth in the BC economy in particular over the last many months, and a bit of an uptick in recovery in Ontario. And if you subtract out those two relatively hot spots, it was a mild to weak performance elsewhere in the country.
Okay, let's talk about Alberta. 9,000 jobs lost in October. However, year over year, we're still up 76,200 positions. Unemployment rate also dropped from 8.1% to 7.6% in October. What's happening in the market here in Alberta?
Well, October was an interesting month for labor market numbers in Alberta, and you almost kind of don't even know where to begin with those numbers because a lot of them seem like they contradict one another. I think the first thing that stands out is that so we had a large surge in employment in September, and at the time it made sense that a lot of women were getting back into the workforce, kids were going back into school, and we saw this large uptick. And there was a very substantial retreat from that. Only not a complete retreat by any stretch, but there were a couple of factors played into that. One is the mandatory vaccination program and how that affected hospitality industries, and that's where we saw a large number of those losses. Like you mentioned, 9,000 jobs lost overall, and there were about 10,000 lost in hospitality industries. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of businesses that we were talking to reported that traffic in restaurants and bars was down significantly. Not in every single instance, but a number of them did report this. And so that's it's cases where if you need to be vaccinated to go into a bar or a restaurant and you're out with your friends and 8 out of 10 of you are vaccinated, and either you go without the two or you decide to do something else and stay home. And so we started to see those kinds of effects playing out in that particular industry. And so that's was the real point of weakness in the economy in October. And the other interesting part too is that there's a lot of noise in the data in October. We saw, as you mentioned, the unemployment rate dropped significantly, but at the same time, the number of people who were unemployed also fell. But at the same time, the number of jobs fell, and there was a large decrease in the participation rate. So the reason the unemployment rate was low is because we saw a large number of people leave the labor force, which is especially odd because in September there was a large number that entered the labor force. Again, these were significant movements in both cases. And so, either there's a lot of volatility in labor markets in Alberta, or probably the more likely explanation is that there's some sort of, I wouldn't say a survey anomaly, but just like a glitch in how this, so sometimes month over month data can be erratic for reasons other than fundamentals in the market. And I think it's possible that's what we're seeing. So, we have to wait for a couple more months to see the dust settle and see where we are then.
Okay, so you did talk about the numbers seem to be kind of wacky in Alberta, and I'm looking at the Calgary region numbers, right? And while Alberta lost jobs, Calgary Stats Canada numbers showing Calgary's employment was up 16,900 for the month. Year over year, it's up 21,600. Unemployment rate in Calgary also fell from 8.9% to 8.0%. So what's happening in the Calgary and area?
Well, there's a couple of things here. So the jobs gains that we saw in Calgary were concentrated in areas like wholesale and retail trade, and in education and healthcare services. And so that's where the big gains were. And the Calgary economy has seen pretty substantial employment growth after stagnating considerably. So the last 2 or 3 months have been quite strong. I think so. There's the resurgence in those industries, which were also reflected in the province-wide numbers. But at the same time, the other issue that's going on here is how those numbers are collected. And I've mentioned this before. So, the Calgary numbers are a 3-month moving average. And so if we saw a large uptick in September, even if the actual number of jobs went down in October, you're still going to see an increase. So it just kind of smooths out that volatility over time. And so it could be that that's what we're seeing with those numbers. But but if you look at a 3-4 month period in time, it certainly has been, there's been a strong uptick in the Calgary market, and it's largely in those industries I just mentioned.
So, Michael, what do you foresee as the outlook for the next 2 months in November and December as we close off the year?
Well, I think that we are going to start to see those. If you look at hospitality and tourism as a particular point of weakness, I think that will rebound in the next couple of months. Ever since the restrictions were announced, vaccination rates have started to go up again a bit in the province, and so I think that we're going to start to see a bit more of a recovery in those industries. And there are others that are doing quite well already. And so that's you look at especially a lot of professional services industries, finance, wholesale and retail trade I mentioned earlier already. Those have been strong points in the provincial economy, and there's no reason to think that won't continue. And as vaccination rates start to fall, as infection rates start to fall, we'll start to see more people going out, I think, and that'll help spark more economic activity.
Okay, here's something I'm curious about, and maybe you could answer this. And by no stretch of the imagination am I anywhere near an economist or a business analyst or whatever, but I see oil prices, up and quite high right now. But am I wrong in saying that I don't see the impact in terms of the job growth in those industries?
No, you're absolutely right. And there has been a little bit of an uptick over the last, say, 6-8 month period of time. Not this last month. Jobs in resource, in extractive industries were actually down, I think, about 4,000 jobs in October. But I think there's a growth ever since 2014, 2015, that oil price crash. A lot of companies realized that they needed to cut their costs. They needed to operate more efficiently and in order to be profitable in a low price environment. And so as prices go back up, they've automated more, they've streamlined more often, and so there's not as much employment required to produce the same amount of output as had been the case in the past. So we're seeing oil prices are high. Companies are starting to make money again this year, especially compared to the dismal year they had in 2020. But that isn't necessarily going to translate into large-scale job growth in the future.
Okay, super. Thanks very much, Michael, for joining us again today.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, that was Michael Holden, Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist for the Business Council of Alberta. I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and this has been Taking Care of Business.